Welcome back, one and all. There are a few people still making their way over from lunch, so please be patient with them as they climb in, but we'd like to get started on the afternoon session. I don't remember whether we mentioned it clearly in the first half of the day or not, but the first two lectures were sponsored by the Carl Rasmussen Fund, and the two lectures this afternoon are sponsored by the George and Janet Harkins Fund. So they are memorial lectures. Wanted to give credit where credit is due to the generous people who supported this program through the years. Our afternoon presentation is called When Credulity is Short-Circuited by Doubt, Faith as an Emergent Phenomenon. And our presenter is Professor Guillermo Hansen from Luther Seminary. I'm really glad that we have colleagues here from other Lutheran institutions. He has served there since 2008 as a professor of systematic theology. He's a native of Argentina and has taught a number of things in a number of places. I won't go into great detail on that, but to say that I have seen him everywhere I go, because, not everywhere perhaps, but the Convocation of Teaching Theologians of the ELCA, he was with a cohort of students from this seminary and others who went to the Lutheran World Federation Assembly in Krakow a few weeks ago. So he's a very active collaborator within the seminary network of the ELCA and a very, very valued colleague. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to welcome you here. Thank you. Thank you,
Right. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. I was telling some of my colleagues here that it was a special moment for me because this is the last seminar of the ELCA that I visit. So I have, I check all of them. So Gettysburg, for one reason or another, he never had the occasion, the opportunity to come here. But finally, here I am. So I'm going to talk on the basis of the PowerPoint. So you don't look at me, look at the images as much as possible. And here you see, in the title, what I'm trying to do, to invite you with me to dive into a rabbit hole kind of thing, as we deal with the reality of faith, the realities of experiencing God, and the reality of doubt. And if I put it in a nutshell, what I'm going to try to dilucidate, to discern, are three different possibilities, even though I'm going to concentrate only on one. The first one is, I put it here in very synthetic way, belief plus doubt, which also equates the operation of reason, leads to faith. So in a way, I am in tune with the two presenters that we heard this morning, that faith is intrinsic to faith, the reality of doubt. At least it is so in the Lutheran tradition, also how we approach scriptures, as we witnessed today with the Psalms, for example, with Diana, and so on. So it's a belief baptized by doubt. Then another possibility, belief minus doubt, which is credulity, the credulous attitude. And we will see that they have the same root, but not the same outcomes. And the third one, of course, also mentioned, belief multiplied by doubt, which could be either secular faith, or I can add, piggybacking on what Veli also mentioned, the kind of postmodern skepticism, right? That is part of our environment, our context. So this is super duper reductionistic, okay? Just for you to have a mental map, of course. I did this word cloud, and not of the presentation, but of the paper that I wrote. By the way, I'm very grateful for the topic because it allowed me to write 2 chapters for my next book on this basis, but I'm not going to go to that. Just for you to have an idea, interesting, belief, very central, doubt, of course, right, appears here, faith there, the word and Luther, yes, very important, my argument, reason, not so much, reflective belief and intuitive belief. These are the basic concepts that you will hear as we move along this afternoon. So let's start with this guy. And when I was looking at an image for Paul Tillich, I found this one very interesting from March 1959. I wasn't born back then yet, but March 1959. And look at that Time magazine, the cover of Time magazine. You know, Paul Tillich. Actually, it's Paul Tillich, but because it's German. But anyways, so I want to honor, which is part of my background, this existential, let's call it existential dimension. I could also have here a picture of Bullman, for example. But Bullman doesn't have many friends among our, in our context nowadays. But you know what I mean, this existential concern that appears in many of the classical Lutheran theologians of the 20th century. And I rescue this, this comes from his Systematic Theology, the volume 1. No one can call himself a theologian. Remember, he's German, so a theologian also means a minister, a pastor, okay? Even if he or she, them, are called to be teachers of theology. Every theologian is committed and alienated, estranged. He's always in faith and in doubt. He's inside and outside the theological circle. Somehow I feel very identified with that. I don't know, because he deformed me back then, you know, in my youth years, or because I have evolved in this direction, and therefore I can see myself somehow reflected in this type of statement. This is one part, faith and doubt. But the other part is this. When Tillich speaks about faith, for example, it's a little book that I always recommend to the students, The Dynamics of Faith. You know, a little one that you can read in one afternoon, where we find this quote, "Faith is a conscious act, and the unconscious elements participate in the creation of faith only if they are taken into the personal center, which transcends each of them." Here I like, because I'm very interested for many, many years in psychology, psychoanalytic theory, especially analytic psychology, which is a Jungian tradition, which Tillich was very indebted to, like Paul Ricoeur too, as well. So here you see a cluster of concerns of mine, the issue of the theological circle, faith and doubt. And on the other hand, what is what faith does? What has to do not only with a set of beliefs, but what happens to me as a person? What kind of integration goes on there? What kind of challenge? What type of personality emerges out of that? So this is also present, and I wanted to bring it into the conversation this afternoon. The existential aspect, psychoanalytical one, but also this other one. And here I am bringing Gustavo Gutierrez and many others from liberation theology to also pay attention to the social dimension involved both in the realities of doubt as well as of faith. And so I would like to suggest a kind of an approach that I like to call it anapisteuo, or you can say it anatheism. I don't like it very much, as Kearney is one theologian who will use that expression. Anapisteuo, you know, meaning to believe again, to believe differently, perhaps, to believe after tragedy, pain, suffering, and death. So I like to move into this anatheism or anapisteuo of people like Job. Diana, we didn't coordinate our presentations, but here you have it again. Born of suffering so intense that one must shriek, speak, accuse, and argue with God, but not about God. You have transcended that already. So I want to pick up that, and also this notion that for me today, the division is not so much between theists and atheists. This is not as important as the division between those who feel the suffering of the world and those who do not. And we will see what is the role of faith and doubt in this issue of suffering as well. This is, by the way, how Gutierrez put, you know, so well, so elegantly, the discussion that Job has with his friends, the theologians, and also his confrontation with God, with the social reality that opens up for for Job, no? The sufferer. Now it's a possibility of seeing the suffering of others as well. So the challenge here is also, in my view, is a challenge to the logic, we can put it that way, the logic and the outcomes or the effects of this brutal reality of ours, which is natural selection, which of course operates mostly the realm of nature, as we all know. You know, we like sometimes, I love science, I love Darwin, or Darwinism and so on, all what has spawned after his discoveries or his theory. But also, if you pay attention to it, it's a brutal history. You know, the fact that we are here alive is due to the fact that many other billions and billions are not here, are dead. They were not viable. So we are survivors in a way. What happened with all these who couldn't make it, no, is the question. What's going on with this law of natural selection? Not to mention the horrible extrapolation of these laws in the realm of biology, even cosmology, to the social realm. Because there we have social Darwinism, which has been so strong, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries. Not only, but especially. Where, you know, the fittest will be the wealthier, you know, those who make it successful, and then the rest in the margins who didn't make it. Anyways, these concerns will be here. So for me, put it together leads to this notion of a radical doubting of the justice of the process that we see in Job. As speaking about God from the suffering of the innocent, as Gutierrez will argue, standing in solidarity with the sufferers and victims of nature and history, which doesn't come, by the way, naturally. So, in the end, I would like to vindicate the place of doubt, the role of doubt. Not only from the point of view of what happened, let's say, in the last 200 years or so, especially in the West, with the different developments, where a more critical stance became possible, but also the place of doubt, as I mentioned before, is the very reality of faith. And here I go to a thinker that we also heard this morning, Wittgenstein. By the way, I can swear to you, we didn't coordinate this at all. Okay, it's just we may have, you know, drunk from the same wells, kind of thing, whatever. But probably a slightly different version of Wittgenstein here, because this is what I want to rescue from him. The same book, Uncertainty, that mentioned this morning, where doubt is possible because we believe in something. Something different of what we are doubting. We always live in a world of beliefs, and this is what is important here, we cannot see out of it. There's no place out of nowhere, so to speak, out of a particular perspective. I think this was mentioned today in this more subjectivist approach. I would call it cultural linguistic approach. So there's no view out of or from nowhere. And always, even skepticism and doubt is also another way of believing. So here is a positive side even to doubt. Yes, and even doubt has as a kernel or has an ultimate concern, to use Tillich's language, as well, which, granted, may be different from ours, but it's also there. So we can also say that doubt does not lead to unbelief, but to believing otherwise. Again, we may not be comfortable with it, but it's another way of believing. Doubt also signifies a different perspective, a different way of looking at things. And I'm going back to this in a moment. And it also signifies a kind of a passage from what I call credulity, is a kind of believing offside, or when we are displaced by the context in which we dwell, or we are displaced within a context, right? So we move from this credulity to faith. Faith understood as an integration of this, of being a person, of what it means to be a human being. with the ultimate, in, with, and under the penultimate. Some of you will understand here, I am nodding toward the sacramental theology of Luther, right? Or the confessions, in, with, and under the penultimate. I will call that, using an expression from physics, a phase transition. I will explain in a moment what is that. So faith is analogous to a phase transition going on with a constellation of beliefs that are put under pressure by a context, by an environment, which allows you to see things differently. And remember here, seeing means also living differently. So, who is this? Diana? Douglas John Hall. Douglas John Hall, yes, but this is a different text of his, Waiting for Gospel, where he has this interesting quote. He's speaking from the pew, let's say, not from the pulpit, from the pew. I do not need sermons that want to demonstrate once more that God really exists, the new atheism notwithstanding. I need sermons that know how frequently I doubt the purpose of my own existence. And here is, I was trying to imagine the audience today, and assuming that many pastors, seminarians, of course, but also pastors may be present, and to sympathize with the dilemma that we have as pastors in congregations, in parishes, and so on. You know what I mean. You know what I mean. When we are in the sacristy Sunday morning, getting robed, about to enter the sanctuary, yeah, the things are in place, and we're still thinking about the address. What are we going to address? How? Do we really have the authority? Especially when what happened with my wife last night, this fight. Do I still have the authority, to be here? You know what I'm saying, Or the struggles that we bring also in the way in which we present what gospel is. So he is with us as well. And, being sympathetic to this ministerial kind of bind, caught in the pulpit, we can call it in a way, where the doubt and faith crisscross each other. And so the questions come, for example, if one doubts a dimension of the propositions of one faith, do I truly believe? I have a problem, with, let's say, the metaphysical implications of the doctrine of the Trinity. This is, propositions. I have some doubts about it. Feminine theology has been very clear throughout the 20th century, late part of the 20th century, still today. If I, question one dimension of this propositional aspect of faith, does it mean that I don't believe anymore, or I am believing otherwise? Or these type of questions. If I do not really believe the traditional propositions, or my belief does not come with the emotional fervor it should, is my salvation at stake? Now, the first one is more, let's call it intellectualist, logos-centered. The second has to do with something that Americans like very much, emotions. At least in my experience, you will not find in other cultures, even Western cultures, the way in which emotions are expressed, right? Which, by the way, I find very good. It's not a critique. But emotionalism or emotions, or what I'm feeling, really can also become kind of a measuring rod for the quality of my faith, or even if my faith is really present. And finally, another question that ministers have is the issue of honesty. Because let's assume that we can take in these issues of doubt that we're having. But then comes the issue of honesty. Honesty to the call and the God in whose name we speak. Not to mention the honesty towards our employers, quote unquote, congregations or synods, or denominations or whatnot. In a nutshell, all this can also, if there's no integration of this issue of doubt and the issue of faith, I am afraid that can lead to a kind of a lousy poimenics and homiletics. Poimenics, pastoral care, and homiletics as well. You know, these are the two core of what Lutheran practice is all about. Ministerial practice is all about. There you have it. This is what I like, you know, very much Hall's approach, because it reminds me of Luther. All what we do as intellectuals, as theologians, as ministers, as church, is for the sake of comforting the troubled conscience of people. Now, today we will expand that, of course, but it's this targeting. That's the issue. That's our business. And one of the means of this approach, of this comforting, is, of course, the preaching of the word and the administration of the sacraments, as we know very well. So this issue of propositional truth or emotionalism or sentimentality for many becomes like a criteria of faith, which is another way of speaking about justification by works. Or, you know, what we find many times in our churches, in our congregations, is like a haven for naive credulity or simple beliefs, what Paul Ricoeur calls a first naivete. And there's nothing wrong with first naivete. The thing is that when it doesn't move out of there. So if you look at especially global Christianity nowadays, you will see that, well, the picture is not very pretty, what's going on in terms of, not only in this country, I'm saying globally, in terms of what is the type of Christianity that really is gaining a lot of traction. A lot of traction. Is this type of Christianity that feeds on this level of credulity, naive credulity, and inculcating, not only acknowledging this credulity, but also inculcating even more naive credulity, not only regarding religious matters, but most importantly, regarding life, regarding society, regarding politics, and so on. So my concern is when there is no integration of what we can call the reflective dimension of belief to the very center of personal life in its confrontation with suffering. Here is where the rubber meets the road. And here is where we engage not only as ministers, pastors, deacons, but also as theologians. And I want to uplift this role that we have as ministers, as pastors. So, credulity for me is believing too little. The church seems to become, as I mentioned, a haven for naive credulity. And the problem with credulity is not that it believes too much, but it believes too little. So let's move now to understand the dynamics of believing, credulity, and doubt, and so on, to what is the consensus today among those who, you know, study how we process information. This information is not just, you know, let's call it logical type of information. It's any type of information. I am processing now, mostly unconsciously, this environment where you are included, right? My brain, my mind is doing billions of operations of which I'm not even aware. So the consensus that we have today, in a much more postmodern, post-foundationalist, right, as we heard this morning, is that we are beings who do things or think things mostly unconsciously. There goes the card, out of the window. All this type of enlightenment rationalism that many of us probably were taught at school, etc., is gone. Because most of our thinking, including moral thinking, including theological or religious, spiritual thinking, is done mostly unconsciously. A very tiny little part of it is reflective or conscious or rich consciousness, which for me is fascinating because it explains in part the power of symbols. Like, for example, when we were now in the worship service, right? The worship service, there's a lot of things going on there that we don't understand. Words that we don't understand, gestures that we don't understand. Yes, of course we understand, we're familiar with it, but where does it come from? That's not the point. The point is that it evokes a kind of a climate, a disposition. It situates us, not only our minds, our bodies. We even sing, together, things that we would not do in normal life, these type of things. Why? Because there's a dimension of who we are which are now addressed, mostly symbolically, through symbols. So let's look at these two ways or two beliefs. We're going to call it intuitive and reflective. Let's see first the intuitive side of things, where beliefs, not just thoughts, beliefs, are products of these innate cognitive mechanisms that has a long, long history in this evolutionary trajectory. The reason why we are alive is because we have this stuff that does things automatically, so to speak. And this is why we survive and still survive, and we are still alive. When you have a radical change of environment, therefore many of these intuitive mechanisms that we have may start to falter and to fail. But so far, so good, we could say. So these intuitive are innate. This is what gives rise to intuitive biology, physics, and psychology. Since we are very, very tiny, babies almost, we already have this intuitive knowledge. We are not tabula rasa. We come with a lot of stuff. We can recognize faces, for example, the importance of having a caretaker that is looking at us, right? We can already situate eyes, we can already picture things. All this is intuitive, yes? And eventually, as you grow up, there is also an intuition about something larger than all this stuff. And this is where religions feed from, right? These intuitive kind of dispositions. But also we have another dimension, which is a reflective one, which is usually what we, here's where we situate the role of thinking and reason. So reflective beliefs come either from conscious, deliberate reasoning, or from external sources of authority, like parents, teachers, and books. So here you see there's something that has to do with a cognitive mechanism that we have to learn, yeah? But on the other hand, has to do with a sociological factor. With whom are you, or to whom you're exposed, especially when you're growing up. You will find around the world, to any Lutheran church, at least that I've been to, with certain exceptions, of course, more, sometimes more of a more charismatic sort, but by and large, there's a kind of a common ethos of Lutheranism. Let's call it that way, whatever that is, right? And probably this has to do because the common thing that we have, again, by and large, is that all of us have been exposed to Luther's small catechism at one point or another of our lives. Not to mention some hymns, common hymns, and some liturgical formats, etc., etc. This is very important. This is part of this reflective aspect that also shape the way in which we think, we perceive the world and ourselves. So what reflective thinking does is that it expands the possibilities to target areas for behavior and reflection. Things that we didn't pay attention to are now up there. They're there in front of us. For example, when I brought the issue of, the reference to Gutierrez, the issue of suffering, with example of Job, etc. Suddenly, the massive suffering of the whole of creation, if you will, not to mention social classes, etc., come into view. This is a new area for targeting behavior and also cognition. And we can give thousands of other examples. This is what religion does, basically. Of course, it can also lead you somewhere else. as it has been traditionally, with a more transcendentalist type of understandings. So in the intuitive dimension that all of us have, what prevails are emotions, feelings first, and then images. So it's not quite true that first in the beginning was the word. Well, according to this version, in the beginning was the image. Not an image that you can describe very, with detail, let's say. But first comes images. And here, another correlation, the issue of parables. If we go to the Gospels. Parables play with images. I mean, you have to imagine the scenario that is being described. And that type of paradigm that is provided by parables is what also allows further reflection. But first you have to situate yourself in this ambience, in this climate of feelings and images elicited by the parable. You cannot just dive in, rationally dissecting, all the logical structure of it, etc. You have to let it talk to you at this level, at this elementary level. But then comes, of course, the reflective side. And here what prevails is now images that are mediated by reflection. You're trying to figure out what does it mean, for example, für mich, for me, pro nobis, for us, or in our world. What does it mean? There's a mediation of a reflective thing. And finally, a logos, and that can be very technical, of course, as you well know, for philosophical texts or some theological texts, you can reach that point. The sweet spot always, in terms of discourse, is when you can connect reflective cognition with intuitive cognition, right? That's a sweet spot. And this is what, to use Hegelian language, this is the realm of Vorstellung, representations. You don't go behind the representations. You just present a story loaded with images, loaded with emotions too. And you try to relate that to the concrete life of people. This is where we situate here mostly for example, in preaching and such. But then you have also a costly religion, a religion meaning here that is highly counterintuitive, that it seems that it doesn't have any point of connection to the type of immediate experiences that one has as a human being. Let's take an example here. Luther himself complaining many times that even he couldn't understand exactly what Paul was referring to by justification by grace through faith. He had to struggle with that as well because it was highly counterintuitive, right? Because intuitively, we are already wired to expect tit for tat, quid pro quo, as usually our experience in life. You do something for somebody or for a cause or whatever in exchange for something else. This transactional kind of relationship. Justification is very counterintuitive because it comes to say that this is for nothing. So these we can package together, understanding beliefs, both intuitive and reflective, as a web. So belief, either when you believe about penultimate or ultimate things, is how we know and inhabit the world. We cannot be in the world without believing in one way or another. Again, this believing cannot be necessarily, or should not be necessarily religious, as we understand it here. They are mostly imagistic, representational, kind of a virtual dimension of reality. We talk a lot about virtual reality today, and we don't realize that we are part of that reality. Pretty much any type of a representation that you do of the world is virtual. And some of this representation we share automatically by the simple fact that we all come from the same ancestors. Our brains work pretty much in the same way, pretty much. And then comes the cultural input, of course, And there you have the different versions of the diversity. But all this is virtual reality. Certain beliefs are stable, often, but others mutate, metamorphizes, or dissolve. So these mutations, which I'm going to call displacements, are the result of different questions and finding different answers in the face of a new constellation of inputs or a new environment. Just as a mental exercise, what do you see there? Do you see anything? Let's start from the basics. Do you see anything? A face, right? A face. This is your intuitive mind. It's a face. Now, if you now latch into your reflective side, you say, no, wait a minute. What is this? You know, I know this is a cave, right? This is a cave. And you know already what a cave is, you know, and you can add up more information, etc. Here you have another example. How we automatically see faces in clouds. In the same way in which Luther, for example, saw the dark side of God by the noise or looking at the leaves, especially in the fall, you know, making noise, with the wind, etc. Immediately came to his mind the darker side of God, the God who is not merciful, the God who is there to get you. Intuitive side. This is an interesting example. All of you, I'm sure, have seen these. Sidonia in Mars. Yeah, you remember that? The speculations about this image taken with one of the Viking, spacecrafts in Mars. A face, we said, that's a sign that there was a civilization, right? And, all the conspiracy theory came, because it's the same mechanism. But this is one perspective, and sure enough, we see a face. But with a displacement, a different perspective, what you see is something different. What you see are topographical accidents that from a different angle creates, we can call the illusion of a face. But in fact, it's a mountain, a very simple mountain. But so just to give you an example of how our mind kicks in immediately with the input that we receive. It does that intuitively. And this, of course, but this is a shift of perspective, not so much geographically or in your context, but inside your mind. You see a rabbit or a duck, yes? So psychologists love this a lot because they can tell a lot about you if you say that you see first a duck or a rabbit. I don't believe that very much, but anyways. So let's move to scriptures and to Genesis 3, where we have the issue of doubt, very much present in the first verse of the chapter. The serpent here representing the doubting side of humanity that asks, well, did God say you shall not eat from any tree in the garden? The little worm of doubt coming in, in the first verse. And then jumping to 4 and 5, the serpent again, confirming, assuring Eve, you shall not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now, of course, we have all heard this type of, this narrative, of course. It's part of our upbringing and so on. I like the interpretation given by, for example, Jung, for example, Tillich, for example, Ricoeur. They will refer to this scene, to this confrontation with doubt as an awakening. An awakening from a primal or innocent dreaming. In other words, it's a history of our coming to consciousness. So we can say that doubting signals the emergence of conscious thought, and with it, the tragedy of cognition, because we realize for the first time that we are naked. That is to say, our finitude, death, estrangement, these existential anxieties as byproduct of evolved emotions. Now we even feel ashamed about ourselves. Interpret negatively this passage that we saw in Genesis usually is interpreted, as sin, unbelief, apostasy, rebellion, disobedience, death. But it can also be seen as a liberating act which releases the primordial human being from the entrapment in the unconscious and the establishment of an ego or a conscious person, which, by the way, will bring a host of new problems, this emergence of a conscious ego. So the fall, we can interpret, is a register of an awakening that can also signify a nightmare, okay? So I'm not presenting here a rosy picture. This is a tragedy of cognition, as it is called. But let's move quickly to Martin Luther. And I'm taking, Luther greatness, we can say, jointly with a beautiful biography by H.G. Haley, a very existential biography, where he starts with Luther's in mid-career with his encounter with the papal, from the Pope, right, the papal delegate going to Saxony to meet Luther, even though this representation here, this picture is from 1518, Luther facing Il Gaetano, Cajetan. This is how we say in English, Cajetan, yeah? The representative of the Pope at the Diet, where he was asked, Luther, again, the worm of doubt, Lutero, imagine an Italian, right? Lutero, solo tu certo es, meaning only you are right. He was, questioning the whole tradition, the whole structure of the church, doubting, what we have inherited. Lutero, anyways. But so Luther greatness, we can say, arose from this ability to draw upon depth of the unconscious. This is why Lutero is still a figura, as Westhelle would say, still speaks to us, because there's a universal dimension, postmodernity notwithstanding, right? But there's still a universal dimension that Luther taps into, the problem of being human. So placing emotional powers at the disposal of an astute intellect. Here we have combined profound intuitive inputs, right? And at the same time, an incredible reflective mind coming together, and the glue of it is doubt. So several fronts of doubt for Luther, as we all know. First, the doubt about the merciful God. This is a classical, approach that we have to Luther. Then doubt about himself and the purpose of his existence. We tend to forget that when Luther, couldn't rely on this external God, so to speak, judgmental God, this lack of compassion, of mercy, he turned towards himself. This is the kind of anticipating the turn of modernity. So turn into your own subjectivity. You will find certainties there as well. No, it didn't work for Luther either. No, it wasn't either outside or inside. So doubts about himself, the purpose of his existence, then doubt about the whole tradition of the Western Church and its medieval institutional expression. We have heard, also this morning, this category of Anfechtungen, the fide tentatio, tristitia, Zweifel, doubt, experiencia, unbelief, doubt, despair. All these concepts are part of the same family to describe the type of this existential situation that Luther was facing. Another way of articulating is emulating the language of the confessions. Remember, this is not a tandem because there are three, but sin, the devil, and death. I would prefer sin, death, and the devil. Sin, let's call it the personal anthropological dimension of this estrangement, crisscrossed by any type of doubts. Then you have death, which is an ontological statement, that's it. And then you have the devil, which is a representational articulation of these both aspects, the anthropological and the ontological. So here we have the devil. And Luther reports that in his battles with the devil, who attacked mostly at night through dreams and thoughts, through doubts, headaches, and body aches, interesting because he involves his whole person. The only thing missing here is the social tension and social conflict, which they were not very aware yet at that time. We have to wait until Marx to really see the tensions in society, right? Class divisions, etc. But here we are previous to that, right? So body aches, the existential doubts, etc. His solution was to stick the demons in his ass. So sorry to being so vulgar, but this is Luther speaking. So sometimes I wonder if we should, change our curricula, in our seminaries, and teach our candidates, how to stick the demons in, But the problem is we have a lot of lawsuits, I think. So I would not recommend to go in this direction. But this is the type of language that he was using to express something of this that concerns him so deeply, these attacks. This is Anfechtungen. So the appeal to the demon gave a framework for understanding what we can call psychospiritual phenomenon, which otherwise will remain undetected without, unthematized, so to speak. So sadness, depression, what he called tristitia, diseases, doubt, attacks are all works of the devil, all verbalization, expression of a deep sense of estrangement. So much was doubt a familiar companion in Luther's experience of faith that he once interrupted his dear colleague and friend, Justus Jonas. Here we have it. Justus Jonas is this one. There you have Melanchthon. There you have Bugenhagen. This is very weird. This is Erasmus. As you can see, this is the freedom and liberty that Lucas Cranach had to represent the event of the Reformation, right? Mixing people that were never together in that way. Anyways, but he interrupted Justus Jonas, who was helping him translate the Old Testament, when he was lionizing Paul as an example of faith, Justus Jonas, saying that he didn't thought, this is Luther speaking, he didn't thought that Paul believed as firmly as he talks in his letters. He also said that he can believe as firmly as he can talk and write about it. This is Luther confessing to Justus Jonas, right? The one thing is to talk about it and write about it, and another one is to truly believe it. Where does it come from? From his table talks. So Luther also has a wonderful commentary, lectures, right, on Genesis. Probably the best of the best. The commentary on Genesis, the commentary on Galatians, the freedom of a Christian, and the Servo Arbitrio. That's it. That's, if you have to choose what to read of Luther, that's it, right? But of course, there are many other things so very interesting. But the basic insight of Luther's commentary of chapter 3 of Genesis is that doubt and unbelief come from listening to another word, the serpent. It's another perspective, another vision, another displacement. The sequence of corruption that Luther describes in Genesis 3 and rebellion follows the human anatomy from the ears, because from here also comes salvation, remember that. Listening, right? And then participating with the elements, etc. But listening primordially from the ears and the intellect, now he started up here, to the hands that pluck the fruit, to the mouth and the teeth that bites it, and then he continues, with intestines, and eventually he was so scatological that eventually, we go out. So the whole person, all the senses, is mobilized by rebellion, by hearing another word. And here's a very important clue, this holistic aspect that we see in Luther, minus the social dimension, of course, I mentioned before, right? But in the sense that the same thing happens when you're listening to another word. The gospel is your whole being, your whole person that is mobilized, not just a part of you, not just a section of you. So ultimately, it is reason trying to reach a decision about the world and God on its own that unleashes the situation of estrangement and eventually also doubt. So I'm going to finish with 3 more slides. I'm going to skip some. What is this displacement that we are experiencing that leads to different types of doubt, to different type of questioning and finding answers? Well, one can understand it like a diagram where you have a referential frame, where you can place all the historical and societal flows, frameworks, and trends that are shaping our lives on a daily basis, many of which we are not even aware. Well, what we refer to as globalization, but the issue of technology, capitalism, the multipolarity of the world, ecological crisis, the social media, the crisis of representation that we see in politics, not only in politics, but also in the church and many other places. That will be the referential frame. But then we can ask, what is going on with our perspectival stance? You know, emotions, images, representations. And here we have to see the impact of science, of living in a truly pluralistic world, of secularism, the individualism and the experiential expressivist bent of our postmodern world, the therapeutic type of culture in which we live, and nothing against therapy, by the way, but therapeutic culture is a different matter. And finally, AI and the altered state of consciousness, which is where we're advancing, as you know, very fast, to the point that probably in 20 or 30 years, it would be a very big business to manipulate emotions, not externally as it's done now, social media, ideology, whatever, but with direct intervention. This is what's the name? Elon Musk is already setting up, no? Neuralink, he called it, which is, you know, probing directly into your brain, where you can effectively change your virtual world, the type of representation that you do of what reality is all about. So let's skip that and say the displacements of context. What changes is 3 things. And this is why we live in a very unique time, as every time is unique, by the way. But ours is very different from the ones that preceded us. So the type of doubting that we see in this representation of doubting Thomas can be very different today, because the figure of the doubter changes, right? What's going on with us, deep inside us, also changes what is doubted. For example, until the 18th century, 19th century, it was not very fashionable to doubt the existence of God. There was not much elements. Yes, there were doubters back in classical Greece too, but they were never massive. They never had a hold in mass culture. Unlike what started to develop in the 19th century, United States thought it was a little exception. Well, it's not, right, of things that already happened, for example, in Europe. So what is doubted has changed, and also the implications about doubting. Where does it lead us? So we finish with, let me skip here very, 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 very fast because we are running out of time. For example, the issue of metaphysical representations, no? What we call supernatural beings, etc. People today, even our churches, even among our colleagues, even among your professors of theology, had tremendous difficulties of, you know, believing in supernatural beings, no? In the classical sense of the term. So one would say, is this a form of atheism, right? And also, when you include afterlife, the soul, the questioning of these realities is one of these aspects, or one of the marks of a major displacement, characterizes the social cultural trajectory of the West during the last 2 centuries. Pay notice that I'm speaking mostly of the West here, okay? This is not what is happening in other parts of the globe. But we're talking about elements in our culture. What we're able to believe today reflectively depends on what previous doubts about reflective beliefs have left us. The displacements that lead us to believe otherwise, and therefore paint former faith as mere credulity. And so this is the displacement of context. And here, I put this interesting image where we can be observing the same phenomena, the moon here. You have the scientists, saying the same awe, not the wow, no, but awe, the sense of awe, mystical awe, if you will, but based on pure reasoning, right? Mathematical, physical reasoning. And here, what the person sees in the other side is God. We're looking at the same phenomena, but completely different perspectives at it. So for me, what we call faith, the anapisteuo, is the movement from mere believing to believing otherwise. Because the context in which we are situated has mutated, has changed. We cannot believe in the same way in which our ancestors believed. So Gianni Vattimo, who is an Italian postmodern philosopher, very well known in Europe and Latin America, not so much here. He's very interesting because he's an atheist, okay? But he says that because we live in a post-metaphysical age, this is what clears the path for believing again. Believing again. To hear again the Bible, coming from an atheist, okay? To hear the stories again from the Bible. Because the Bible contains a message to which I must respond. And this is very similar to, I would say, to Luther, his notion of gospel, but also to Bullman, kerygma. The kerygma never stays there floating. It evokes a response from you, or even a rejection, but it will not stay neutral. So Paul Ricoeur is another one moving in this direction, calling for a second naivete, a belief, a wager which arises after atheism, unbelief, and doubt. So it's this after faith, or faith after faith, if you will. And finally, I mentioned, I don't like this theologian very much, by the way, but I have to give him credit of coming up with this notion of anatheism. I would like to change it for anapisteuo. Okay, we have more, but I have to stop here to honor the audience and to listen to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions and then a short 5-minute stretch break. During that break, I'd like to ask all the speakers and Dr. Irwin to meet here in the atrium so we can get a group photo. So the communications people will be happy. Okay, questions? So I'm just going to take advantage of the moment, and I'll give it right to you. You were pinging all over my radar, Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, how what we think is a cognitive process is largely emotive, actually. That we're
totally
riding the emotional elephant, as it were, and it's really in control, and we think we're controlling it, but it's really leading us.
Which creates a lot of conundrums, and this is interesting to revisit Luther's servo arbitrio. You know the anecdote of Bonhoeffer at Union in his first visit in 31, where he was taken aback when in one classroom, probably it was a neighbor, brought to the conversation in the classroom Luther's servo arbitrio. And all the students were laughing, right? Oh, look at Luther, he just didn't believe in free will. I mean, what a stupid idea, right? This is very much ingrained in our culture, that we are free. We have a free will. Luther's argument, servo arbitrio, the bondage of the will. Well, what today cognitive studies are showing, demonstrating, is precisely that we're so bounded that we don't even realize it. That's the extent of our bondage. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Guillermo. I'm wondering, I'm really interested in the slide about displacements that lead to doubt. And, you know, with the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, there was a lot of attention on Luther's use of media, thinking about the book Brand Luther and how Luther used the printing press and how he used images in a way that people hadn't used before. His was the most recognized face in Europe.
Yeah.
And then there was an Economist article called The Viral Reformer, and that Luther doing mass producing of these short pamphlets was kind of like tweets are today in social media. So if we think about displacements and you had social media on there that leads to doubt, I just wonder about those vehicles and Luther using a vehicle that no doubt was a displacement for many in his time, and just how using these vehicles to get his message out, like how that relates to the doubt piece.
Yeah. Well, there were two things going on at the 16th century, right? There was, for example, the pamphlets, as you mentioned, which really were the means of propaganda. The Reformation reached little villages, etc., because of the pamphlets, not because of Luther's writings. And it really made a difference in the actual pastoral practice of confession by the Pfarrer, no? By the Pfarrer, the priests, with the Lutheran twist. Pastoral care, we call it today. So pamphlets at the popular level, and this, what I show you about the devil, for example, is one of these representations. No? There are many others, but this is one level, popular level. And then you have the treatises, which is mostly what we read in class, and for example, the catechisms will also be an example. There, he's targeting another level, the more reflective level, if you will, whereas the pamphlet lodges into your more intuitive side, because you get a kick seeing, the devil, how should I put in elegant English, doing number 2, and out of this come the bishops and the pope and priests, all the dirty things that you see around you or whatever. This appeals to the intuitive side. Now, fast forward, 21st century, social media. How not to be a Luddite, or Luddite, how we say, Luddite or Luddite? Luddite. Because I love technology. I am, completely immersed into technology. I don't have any problem of becoming a cyborg at one point in my life. Actually, I am a kind of, because one of my eyes has a special thing inside of. That's a kind of a cyborg too. But no problem with that. No, with this progress that comes with this aspect of technology. My problem is, in the case of social media, what we call today social media, TikTok, or what. By the way, I have abandoned all social media. I made a choice. It was very detrimental to my well-being. This is me talking, not necessarily you. Me, out. What is the problem with social media? The social media only appeals to this intuitive side, the immediate side. And therefore, it creates these type of frictions and fractures in our societies, because there is no much reflective mediation. Even the targeting that AI does, right, is not to facilitate this other side of us, this other side, more reflective side of us, but it's the raw and the worst parts of the intuitive side of us. So my question is, okay, the Reformation had both sides to it, right? But there was a clarity that the role of the reflective side embodied, let's say, in the teaching of the church, the pastors, etc., will also help to direct this emotional side that we have always at a popular level. The question today is, what is this reflective level that helps to moderate our intuitive, let's say, volcano that comes through social media? This is what I don't see present, because we live in a radical crisis of representation. Nobody wants to be mediated in their ideations, in their thoughts, in their feelings. That has a tremendous repercussion on us in the church, in our proclaiming the word, the gospel. I want to feel it by myself kind of thing, attitude. But also, and most importantly, has tremendous repercussion in politics, particularly democracy. Democracy cannot survive in this purely intuitive realm and all the fragmentation that it generates. It enters into crisis and dissolves, and we know the story, what comes after that, because you always need a certain order. What comes after democracy? New forms of authoritarianism. So that is my suspicion. I don't have an answer. I am very suspicious about social media. I am not discouraging you to engage it, because this is certain demographics. This is the first point of contact they can have with something different. But I'm not very trustful of that.
So on that hopeful note, no, thank you so much for your wisdom.
Okay.
And we'll take 5 minutes. Speakers, if you could join me in the atrium, I'll get a photograph, and all will be
All
well.
right.
All right, we are assembling once again in our space of learning. I've been asked if we have t-shirts available describing Luther's methodology of getting rid of demons. I'm sorry, they are not yet printed. Perhaps they already have them at Luther Seminary. You can check with them. But I am going to be introducing a dear friend and colleague who's been with us for 2 years now, and she has been such a gift to the community at United Lutheran Seminary. Dr. Natalia Marandiuc is an associate professor of systematic theology here, where she also directs the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. She co-chairs the Christian Systematic Theology Unit within the American Academy of Religion, serves in the steering committee of AAR's Kierkegaard Religion and Culture Unit, and is on the advising board of Logia, an organization that supports women scholars in theology and religion. Dr. Marandiuc is a constructive, systematic theologian whose work intersects historical theology with feminist, gender, race, and queer theory, post-colonial migration studies, liberation hermeneutics, and psychology. Her first book, The Goodness of Home, Human and Divine Love and the Making of the Self, was published by Oxford University Press in 2018 and won the Aldersgate Prize. She is currently working on 2 book projects, Love, Justice, and Thriving, a queer feminist soteriology, for which she received a grant from the Templeton Foundation, and A Theology of Human Migration. She is also co-editing the forthcoming Oxford Handbook on Theological Method. Please help me welcome my friend and colleague, Natalia Marandiuc.
Thank you very much, Martin, for this generous and kind introduction. Just one moment here. I'm a tall person, so this is lower, so I just want to make sure I read it properly. Okay, one moment here. Okay, here we go. There. There we go. So the title of my talk today comes from a larger project. So there will be different fragments that I put together in a hopefully coherent way. And I titled it Trauma, Memory, and Doubt. Luther on Anfechtungen and the Flow of Divine Love. Christian theological narratives often, though not always, center on salvation. Presented as good news, soteriologically driven thought can, and at times, does create an equivalence between salvific faith and the sort of assurance that runs the risk of overemphasizing certainty. Perhaps the temptation to seek certainty is particularly strong in contexts of adversity, injustice, harm, and pain. Liberation theologies, at least in part, suggest that the Savior does liberate us from oppression. And while we might be doubting our finite power to overturn injustice, even when we strive toward it anchored in our faith, we can trust in God's promise, which is reality-making, so certain that God does extricate us from harm and structures of harm. But what if, womanist theologian Dolores Williams asks, what if God does not always liberate? What if the story needs to be told differently to account for living in a world where pain and injustice perdure? What if doubt is an inescapable ingredient of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love? What if, as Dolores Williams argues, what matters more than the certainty of liberation is creating conditions for survival, quality of life, and right relations? I contend that her vision for a theology and ministry of life and love is particularly important during the times we traverse now. Post-pandemic, when the horrendous atrocities in Israel and Gaza are multiplying the numbers of the dead, the maimed, and the traumatized by the hour, when a Holocaust survival is dragged in captivity on live TV, when you can see the climate disaster that humanity created when you check the weather forecast on your iPhone in the morning, when you hear of more people forced to migrate with even more trauma, and when the racialized capitalism in which we are steeped mixes with force-fitting of human genders and sexualities in impossible Procrustean beds aimed to increase the control of bodies and the destruction of lives. It is imperative then to ask, how can the articulation of theology contribute to survival, quality of life, and indeed, loving relations conducive to such life? Perhaps we should not doubt so much. So in this paper, I will argue, with some detours, in psychology, that Luther's theology centers on a framework of divine love that is roomy enough for us to participate in it with our doubts, afflictions, and traumas, and through which we can love our human neighbors in life-giving, justice-oriented ways. Søren Kierkegaard, whose thought is much indebted to Martin Luther, speaks of doubt and uncertainty at the heart of the Christian faith. In fact, the one thing that is true in life, truth itself, according to Kierkegaard, is an objective uncertainty. It is the highest truth available for an existing subject, he says in the postscript, and it counts as an equivalent description of faith, he says. Then he adds, quote, if I can grasp God objectively, I do not believe because I cannot know God objectively. I must have faith. But if I preserve myself in faith, I must constantly be determined to hold fast to the objective uncertainty objective uncertainty, accent on uncertainty, so as to remain out upon the ocean's deep, over 70,000 fathoms of water, end quote. Hardly a picture of unchallenged assurance. Floating on uncertain waters might well be an all too evocative metaphor for the contemporary world. And perhaps an apt allusion to climate change. Now, Luther himself, in whose tradition Kierkegaard writes, invoked doubt in multiple ways. He spoke of doubt in relation to the knowledge of God, though not so much the existence of God, which hardly anyone doubted in the Middle Ages, but rather human existential knowledge that God is present to us rather than hidden, or rather than only hidden, and good to us rather than indifferent or punitive. This epistemology of divine goodness and closeness maps, of course, on Luther's theology of Deus Revelatus, the revealed God, whose gift of faith and love is just to be received. Yet, this divine revelation is not ours to possess, to control, or to dispose of. It remains alien to us. And it is always in tension with the reality of divine transcendence, or Deus absconditus, a hidden God, absconding. Hidden God beyond what we can appropriate, and whose ways are not our ways. Now, this framework is not only an abstract one of cognitive theological epistemology. Luther's theology is deeply pastoral. His concern with doubt are most often expressed by a hard-to-translate German word, Anfechtung, which he uses mainly in the plural, Anfechtungen. And by this he means something like challenges to the faith, tribulations, faith temptations, afflictions, or trials, and a form of spiritual anxiety or spiritual despair. Now, this is not a kind of despair we talk about in common language when we lose or lack something that matters to us even deeply, but rather something like the unfaith or doubt that accompanies faith and whatever afflicts us. To have a better sense of it, I will fast forward for a moment again to Kierkegaard, who writes in the same vein and equates despair with what he calls the lack of the eternal, or rather our subjective perception of it. He says, quote, "Despair is not something that can happen to a person, an event such as good fortune or misfortune. Despair is something else. It's a misrelation in a person's inner being. No fate or event or misfortune can penetrate so far and so deep. It can only make manifest the misrelation that was already there," end quote. So he thinks that favorable life events can easily hide this state of despair from one's own introspection, while misfortune could make it more obvious, if one thinks that the misfortunes alone are the cause of despair. But that is to confuse categories. So he says despair is not a loss. That might be unhappiness, pain, suffering. But despair is really the lack of the eternal. The antidote is participation by faith in the unceasing flow of divine love. However, we have no full epistemic access in this lifetime to this participation. We have a partial access. So we have a sense, a perception of our faith, and we have a perception that correlates to our faith of God's love for us that is unchanging, but our perception is not stable. Only God's love is. So Anfechtungen are part of the Christian faith and thus part of the human life. Now, Luther was a theologically trained monk, part of the Augustinian order, and so he was struggling to make sense, not only theoretically, but in his own existence, of what it means to be found righteous before God. And he describes his turmoil quite vividly in an autobiographical text. He says, "Though I lived as a monk without reproach, I felt that I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience. I could not believe that God was placated by my satisfaction. I hated the righteous God who punished sinners, and secretly, if not blasphemously, certainly murmuring greatly, I was angry with God. I raged with a fierce and troubled conscience." End quote. Luther's worry regarding his anguished conscience then leads him to ask, how can he be made right with God? How can he find favor with God, given God's commands and his and our, by extension, incessant struggles, Anfechtungen, with sin, with trouble, with turmoil, all of this preventing us from being right with God, being in a state of tranquility in God's peace. Now, he eventually saw a breakthrough by reading the epistle to Romans and discovers thereby that righteousness is unearnable. So he calls it a passive righteousness by which God, who is merciful, justifies us by faith. The human person contributes nothing. God's self gives it. It's not a human work. It's God's gift to us. Yes, yet it takes place within the human person. It remains alien, it remains God's, yet it's located within. Perhaps a way of looking at the scriptural text that speaks about being in the world but not of the world. He describes his own experience. Here I felt that I was altogether reborn and had entered paradise itself through open gates. As we'll see, well, this is the description of a seemingly solitary experience. He speaks in powerful ways of the ways in which human affliction, human spiritual afflictions, the Anfechtungen, are always attenuated, and we live through them and with them best in the company of others. Now, Luther, like the scholastic theologians whom he vehemently critiques, and colorfully so, and at times misinterprets, so with them altogether he belongs to a distinctively non-modern paradigm. And I'm emphasizing this because I'm going to show how we find in Luther resources for us today, but with the caveat that there are some distinctions that need to be named. Now, modernity often entails grappling with the question of meaning. For example, meaning of life. So that an individual often questions a whole paradigm of existence and refuses its terms, may choose an altogether different framework of life, and perhaps worries that there is no paradigm to be found at all that would contain a satisfying meaning for one's life. The troubles in today's world can certainly bring one to feeling that the meaning of life is lost or can never be found. No wonder there is a cornucopia of apocalyptic literature, scholarly and otherwise, on the market. But this is not the nature of Luther's crisis taken in its own terms. Choosing among different systems of meaning, and we might be tempted to do so when the world is falling apart, so this was not even imaginable in terms of choosing frameworks of meaning in the intellectual and practical and spiritual universe that Luther inhabited. Rather, his problem was how close, or actually far away, he was from the demands of a framework of life that he took, like anybody else, for granted. Something like a given canopy, not a matter of one's own construal, which we are tempted to do today. We construct our own meaning. We construct the sort of bubble in which we live, and certain things are inside, certain things are outside. Welcome modernity. Luther was before. And still much of the world has never encountered modernity, including my own homeland, where I was raised in Romania. With, again, some caveats, but that's for another talk. So Luther lived his life under the auspices of a monastic culture where he was pressed to seek salvation, salvific union with God, and escape damnation. So he grew terribly anxious over his inability to do so and to keep up with the requirements that he perceived to be placed over him by the religious system to which he belonged and he perceived as unmutable, together with everyone else. Now, a contemporary philosopher who wrote on such matters, Charles Taylor, puts it this way. Luther's crisis was turning around the acute sense of condemnation and irremediable exile, rather than around a modern sense of meaninglessness, or lack of purpose, or emptiness, which is a feeling and a state that is often described by some of my students, and I'm sure some of you who teach undergraduates might hear that quite a bit. I hear from teenagers in the church where I attend sometimes. So Luther found liberation from the life-quenching fear of inescapable damnation by finally embracing salvation by faith, but did not question the terms of this damnation or salvation understood in those terms. Taylor puts the dot on the I here by saying that the danger here is utterly different than what we might find in the contemporary world, because we might experience things that could be worded such as like a fear of terrifying emptiness, and kind of a spiritual or emotional vertigo, or even a fracturing of our world or body space. And people who have experienced trauma often speak precisely in these terms. And he's not a trauma theorist. So he concludes the existential predicament in which one fears condemnation is quite different from the one where one fears, above all, meaninglessness. However, Luther's experiences with Anfechtungen first do not stop with his conversion, but continued during his lifetime as an accompaniment to the life of faith. Secondly, even accounting for the paradigm shift that modernity brings about later, his experiences and the theology rooted in them is a large source, I argue, for contemporary theology and Christian life. As a small parenthesis here, Charles Taylor also thinks that one significant difference between the pre-modern or non-modern world that Luther inhabits and the contemporary modern and postmodern world is that the latter, our world, contains an emphatic affirmation of the ordinary life. We don't seek some sort of a good life above and beyond the ordinary, kind of nobility or something above and beyond, but rather the good life is within the life of the ordinary. I do argue that this is also a way in which Luther is an enormous resource for the contemporary Christian life and contemporary theology, particularly for feminist and queer theology, in that his framework of that God's unconditional life translates into our participation in this love by God's own act, and therefore we are conduits of God's love to people in their own terms, this translates well into the kind of predicament that we have today, and it might well be one of the significant ways in which Luther is a linchpin between medieval time and what follows, Renaissance and early modernity. Well, he's still a deeply medieval man, but nonetheless there are glimpses that move the spiritual and intellectual universe, I think, forward, and this might well be one of them. To make more sense of this, I will contain excursus in the way in which we as modern people understand some of the worst afflictions that can happen to us and have been theorized in psychological literature as trauma and the way this affects our memory. Now, is trauma the same as what Luther calls Anfechtungen? Not quite. However, I think there is something that we can call spiritual trauma in the contemporary world. And I think there are resonances between what we call clinically and in daily parlance trauma and what Luther had in mind when he talked about Anfechtungen and some of the ways in which our love expressed as the love for the neighbor, channeling God's love, might be a resource for us to understand some of the way in which contemporary psychology speaks about possibility of some level of well-being after trauma. Okay. So etymologically, trauma comes from a Greek word denoting a wound. Trauma theorist Judith Herman describes traumatic events as those in which a person feels utterly helpless in the face of a force that is perceived to be life-threatening. She is not talking about threatening of one's meaning-making, although it could be the case that something that is life-threatening and therefore aptly described as horror could also destroy someone's possibility of meaning-making. The specific response to trauma is not uniform, although some events are so terrible that it is hard to imagine that anyone would not at least somehow be affected fairly traumatically by them. And unfortunately, we have plenty of daily news to illustrate that. According to clinical research, most people exposed to traumatic stressors become so preoccupied with the original events that caused them that they experience involuntary intrusive memories that repeatedly replay what happened to them. While for some people the content of such memories may become more tolerable in time, they rarely truly fade, but one may learn to live with them. Those who develop PTSD or complex PTSD start organizing their lives around the trauma. The memory of trauma fails to let the self and let itself, the memory itself, to be integrated in one's personal past. So it becomes something like an independent, haunting presence in one's mind. The memory of harm can cut very deeply in our psychology and, in fact, into our bodies as well. Human memory is not simply cognitive. It resides in our emotions and in our bodies. Emotions are overwhelmingly correlated to our body chemistry. Many of us know that. But in the case of traumatic memories, it's as if the totality of one's mind as well as body is no longer a home that properly integrates such memories. So the experience of persistent intrusions of trauma remembrances has the effect of limiting all else life experiences, such as relating to other people, relating to the environment. Even after decades of the original experience, some of those who experience trauma in a clinical sense, or even in a sense that may not be clinicized, but it's genuinely enormous for the person. this event can remain embedded in the body as a contemporary relived event. And it doesn't let itself be integrated in a memory of the past. So it sort of circulates freely within the body, and it shows up anytime, any moment, and anything can be a trigger. Therefore, people who theorize trauma speak about how victims of trauma tend to re-expose themselves to situations that are reminiscent of the traumatic event, either in the role of victimizer or victim again. As such, victims of trauma, people who participate in trauma, often perceive that the boundary between the self and the external world has been broken. Oftentimes, one can reasonably describe that whatever was traumatic comes from the outside, breaks apart the sort of membrane that gives you a sense that there is you and there is what's not you outside of you. And when once that is broken open, it cannot be put back together again. So the self, who the person is no longer protected from whatever threats the universe outside possess to the person and to one's body. So how can we live with that? And what can Luther say to us that we might have some resource in his thought that we might find useful? Before I go there, I'm going to say one more thing about this, having to do with research that shows how, at least in a partial way, victims of trauma can find a measure of the possibility of reliving. So, in the words of Dolores Williams, survival, a level of quality of life, and right-ish relations. So, research shows that this possibility of at least partially remaking the self occurs in the context of relations. And these relations are asymmetrical. So there needs to be another person, sometimes a therapist, but not necessarily, who recircuits the broken self through another person's self, body, presence, providing some kind of an external anchor. So that through this kind of a circuit of empathetic listening and participation in the victim's life and in the victim's story, the shattered self has kind of a borrowed anchor from another, and potentially, slowly find a way of subsisting going forward. So only in the presence of another human being, then, the trauma sufferer can hope to reconstitute her subjectivity in the form of an internal voice that becomes internal from listening to the external presence of another listener. So therefore, it's kind of again, a kind of a borrowing mechanism that gives stability to the shattered self to some degree. And I always qualify this because so many people never quite get too far in this process. But can we speak about some level of hope? Clinical research shows some, I think, promise, but from what I read, it's limited. Okay, so one more step in this description of how relationality and specifically a certain kind of highly empathetic relations, in Christian terms, loving relations, constitute the self and reconstitute the self when the self is broken by trauma. In order to do that, I will refer to another body of psychological research known as attachment theory, which I would argue is a correlative to trauma theory, even though different sets of different kinds of psychologists and neuroscientists work in these two areas. With respect to attachment theory and attachment neuroscience, research shows that certain kinds of human relations become so much part of who we are, that they become sine qua non components in our basic bodily development and neurological development as well. But it starts down with the body, with the development of the entirety of the body. In the life of infants, for example, it's not only the case that they don't survive if they are not fed by others and have their diapers changed by others, but if they are not held, they never develop their bodies properly. If they are not attached in a way that is emotional, but also it has neurological component, their brains never develop to maturity. The memory is not formed properly. The way in which we associate external experiences with kind of a representation on the brain never forms properly. And all kinds of other ways in which human beings don't grow into a mature sense of self. Now, I have, in my home country, Romania, I have worked in my home church there with some of the survivors of the infamous Romanian orphanages and the kind of state houses for the children. And some of these women, I work with women particularly, are in their 40s, I think some are in their 50s, and they behave like children who are in kindergarten. They never developed further than that. And I can speak that now from experience because I have small children and I know what that looks like. And it's incredibly similar. So I have lived in my own life a kind of a confirmation what I researched and saw that clinicians and theoreticians speak of when they say that forming an attachment system gives one a sense of self, and then trauma theorists add to that, and they might recreate the self when the self is destroyed through experiences of quite enormous harm. So close relations of attachment, which I translate in my own theological understanding of how to make sense of it, I translate it as relations of love, and specifically relations of close love toward our human neighbors. Form ourself, reform ourself when it is malformed, and form and potentially reform our neurological system down to the synapses, neurological synapses in the brain that enable us to have a representation of reality, relations, and who we are. We don't know, researchers don't know to what extent the brain and the body and the sense of self are plastic, but they don't question whether they are. This is non-controversial. What is controversial is to what extent, how can we measure it, but that we are talking about high-level plasticity is quite a consensus. Okay, so how is this related more concretely to Christian theology and specifically to Martin Luther? I want to argue that the way in which our relations of attachment work in our comportment with and toward other people is such that we can at best be partial participants in other people's stories, but we can to some extent. All right, so how so? And here is where theologically it makes sense to speak about the way in which on our own we cannot do much. Because all of us, to one degree or another, some to a larger degree than others, are distorted, malformed. None of us are exempt from the world that is suffused with what traditionally has been called original sin, what more contemporary theologians call structural and systemic sin. We are all affected by it. So then it makes sense to speak about God's grace that is like a lever that is put underneath all of this to lift us up above the kind of a background distortion in which we are all entangled. But what does grace actually do? Luther conceptualized grace as the flow of love that comes from God to us creatures. God is fundamentally a giver. God loves and God gives. We receive, full stop. The content of what we receive is God's love. We call it God's grace because it is unmerited, uncalled for. And what we receive, we are to give further to our neighbor, to fellow human beings. Now, we are conduits, transmitters of what God gives to us. We love our neighbors, not on our own steam, so to speak, but we are the alien receivers and further transmitters of this love material that is God's own, according to Luther. Now, God's grace is not an end in itself, because God's grace is something that puts us in the right relation with God, but the end is love. God loves us in order for us to love the others. We can't fulfill God's commandment to love God and to love our neighbor unless God God's self enables us to do so. So there is a correspondence here between how God is a giver and we human beings are receivers. There is a kind of a match. God created us to be receivers as God God's self is a giver. And the flow of God's love is always from God to us. We are not initiators. We are receivers, and as receivers, we become conduits toward the others. So in a sense, then, we are in the middle of God's love toward the others. We participate in this flow that comes from God and terminates in the neighbor. We are not enabling as creatures who are able to originate it, but derivatively, we participate in a way that blesses us and blesses the others. And this has enormous correspondences with what attachment and trauma theorists talk about when they speak about the recircuiting of the self through another, both to form the self and to reform it when broken apart by trauma experiences. Now, two more things to allow sufficient time for questions and conversation. At the heart of Luther's thought here is not so much a moral framework that might be conducive to a theology of salvation, a kind of soteriology that is anchoring in certainty, but rather a framework that transcends morality and envisions something that is beyond morality itself and is perhaps a condition of the possibility of moral systems in the world and in our theology and ethics, namely the reality of God, who is the reality of unconditional, creative, transformative love. Luther critiques the church system that he perceived to be based on the principle of not enough, how can we get to be good enough? He then suggests that, and one could interpret him to suggest that, this is a matter of, God is the broker, ultimately, of how we can understand righteousness and how we can understand how we are pleasing toward God. Because God gives the means for righteousness. They are God's grace, God's love, alien to us. But this kind of glides us into an understanding of a moral relation between God and the world. And I have been influenced in this thought by my earlier mentor, Miroslav Volf, who has done some research on Luther, and who argues that the key to understand Luther is to think of God, as Luther says in his commentary on Galatians, for God is the one who dispenses God's gifts freely to all. And this is the praise of God's deity. So God then cannot defend, so to speak, God's own deity against self-righteous people who don't want to accept the gift, but want to earn a reward. They might want to rob God of God's own deity. So they remain within a moral framework kind of limitation, within an economy of moral exchanges. But God, in Luther's understanding, functions above and beyond this sort of framework, enabling it but transcending it at the same time as the giver freely of the sort of love that creates the world, creates human beings in the world, and recreates human beings when the human beings are turning away from God and are basically laying down in the precipice of despair. This is why it makes sense to think with Luther that the spiritual despair, the Anfechtungen, have their antidote, not so much in our perception of how we are doing with faith, which might be a moral judgment or akin to a moral judgment, but in the reality of God's love, which is flowing toward us and enabling us, whether we are cognizant of it or not, emotionally attuned to it or not, yet we are channeling it toward the neighbor who is basically our fellow human being, because that's the very nature of God's love. So to sum it up, Luther himself emphasizes, especially in his numerous letters or in his table talk and other writings of that more private sort, he emphasizes a kind of a pastoral dimension of how God's love functions as percolating through human relations, through the human neighborhood. And so he counsels people to offer presence and companionship to those in turmoil, despair, and affliction. And he uses incredibly pertinent terms that we can decipher in the context of contemporary psychology and therapy. And he further counsels those who find themselves in turmoil and despair to seek the company of others. So one can sense here a theology of deep solidarity. And I would like to argue, just as a vista toward further conversation, that it is this theology of deep solidarity rooted in a framework of profound divine love that anchors everything that is, that it is here that we can start thinking theologically about possibilities of justice in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these words of hope. We have time for a few questions before we all hit rush hour. So,
Yes. Should I field the questions or? Okay.
Thank you, Natalia. Very interesting and insightful presentation. I'm speaking to the main concept of your presentation, namely love. Whereas often it is said that Luther was a theologian of justification,
Yeah.
which he of course was. Because I was trained at the University of Helsinki
Yeah.
in the so-called Mannerma School, so he was my doctor father. For decades, Mannerma School has argued that most prominently Luther is a theologian of love and even justification is a sub-theme, and that is and love is integrally connected with the theology of the cross.
Right.
So here is coming together of many themes. So therefore, I just wanted to, I have less a question and an endorsement of your project. It's very appropriate in a Lutheran setting to talk about trauma and suffering and those kinds of things through the lens of love.
Right. Yeah, so I did not emphasize here explicitly a theology of the cross. That is true. But one of the ways in which I would bring together what I try to present and Luther's emphatic theology of the cross is to speak, for example, of the way in which I believe in the Heidelberg Disputation, Luther speaks of how the love of God is recreating the person. I mean, he's not using exactly these terms, but it goes all the way down to the sinner, to bring the sinner up from the bottom of the sea, as it were. Again, this is my metaphor. But so it's recreating what has become the devastated creation. So the love of the love of God is the love of the God who goes all the way down on the cross to the worst of the sinners. So there is nothing that is too down low. It goes all the way to hell.
This is just directly, thank you very much, and this is directly to this last exchange here.
Yep.
Because going all the way down to the sinner, today we would have a hard time saying things like that to people. We might say going all the way down to the traumatized.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that would be enough of an equivalent in your mind. What is being missed there?
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. I wouldn't make exactly an equivalence between those, between sin and trauma. In the sense that to be traumatized is not to be sinful, and to be sinful is not only or quite to be traumatized. That would be problematic in a number of ways, because that would mean that we think that illness or some form of horror that is inflicted on us is either consequential of sin, or it generates sin in the victim, which is even worse. So there is no equivalence in that sense. Where one can say there is a connection, rather, would be that to inflict injustice is sinful. To inflict trauma in any form is sinful. Furthermore, systems that generate trauma are in themselves sinful. So we can talk about structural and systemic sin in that way, like literally directly, because insofar as it harms God's creatures. That's a source of sin. But furthermore,
this is why I asked the question. I'm thinking of some people who might feel so alienated from God because of whatever condition or experiences that they've had. Maybe not their own fault, but to say that Christ descends so low to be with the sinner is a way to say that there's no separation ever. No, there's no condition of ours that could separate us from God's love.
Right.
So I'm thinking of that person. I don't think the word sinner works or is received in our contemporary language very well. So I'm looking for, that's what I'm saying.
Right, I hear you. So it's true that the language of sin is less used than the language of therapy. In churches, perhaps, in the contemporary culture, which of course is not necessarily a theological or religiously or religious culture understood in these theological terms. So it's much more tempting to think of, well, we can explain this by this particular therapy theory, or we can maybe heal it if we just do this, medication plus therapy. And I think there is some danger in fully equating what is problematic in human life with just psychological malfunctioning, even if it's, perhaps a kind of ideologically induced psychological malfunction, or I think there needs to be some conceptual room to name evil as evil, theologically. And while there are connections between evil as a source of trauma, I would not equate them. Evil always harms, but trauma in and of itself, there are more complicated connections there than simply to put an equality sign. But I think I understand your question, like, what has become of our language that is more theological, right? When we retreat into the language of psychology. Okay, sounds good. Look forward to that.
I don't have any argument at all with your characterization of Luther's theology as being one based in love. That's the same thing I learned as well. And it's very important and useful that you are connecting trauma to this as one of the conditions that God's love is addressing. The one question I would have, though, is that for Luther, it's not just about God and God's love on the one side and the human need for God's love and human frailty in the face of that on the other, but there's actually a powerful counterforce in the terms of satanic, demonic, direct, existent evil in the world that is working on the human from outside as well. That's very foreign to our modern way of thinking.
Correct.
But it's really fundamental to Luther. And
Yes.
so you get a slightly distorted view of Luther if you leave it out, I think.
That is true, and yes, Luther was, of course, convinced of Satan, being around, and the whole crew of devils working against him and against the church, and we in the modern world, especially here, don't hear much about that sort of language. And yes, in my presentation, I didn't speak of that. But I too grew up in a world where, Satan is all over the place. And I grew up in a kind of Anabaptist environment, complicated more. It's not like the Western one. But particularly in the larger context of my country, of the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Church, my goodness, the priest came to sprinkle sanctifying holy water all over the house in every corner, because there might be another devil in that corner. Are you sure you went to the pantry too? There might be one hidden there as well. So this is very familiar to me. When I read Luther on that front, is something that I realize in my Western lingo. There are little correspondences, but on the other hand, here is, Brother Martin speaking my language back home. So how do we make sense of it? And how do we make sense of it here? I think we might have different ways to embody evil than the more ancient personifications of evil. But if we look at beyond the metaphors, might we get to something that might not be that distinct? Open question.
Natalia, thank you so much. I have a question about intergenerational trauma, if you've given that thought and what Luther might have to offer us in that respect. From my grandmother's hands by Menachem is so brilliant, and I have struggled with kind of inheriting, I would say, a pattern of, I don't know how to say this, ritual spanking over generations.
Yes.
And that's, domestic abuse issues are often seem to be generational. So I was just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, intergenerational trauma is not to be dismissed. I think people who go quickly over it, I think, are inflicting further trauma. And if there is a connection between sin and trauma, here's another one, namely that, sin tends to hide itself. You only see it in the light of grace. To hide the reality of trauma is to generate more sin, because it creating an invisibility of what tends to conceal itself in its very properties. Sin, insofar as sin is a thing as opposed to the absence of a thing, and that gets personified in a powerful way. But in terms of more concretely, what Luther could say, or what Luther's theology would have to say to intergenerational trauma. Here's what I think. I think having experienced myself a lot of trouble in my life as rooted in prior generations, and in a way having found healing as an immigrant, ironically, in the US, away from it, what I discovered was, first personally, and then through some readings, so kind of the scholarship came after the experience, was that I can go backward and bring some of the ways in which I have been loved well here in my contemporary context, and taking it back to my mother who never mothered me. I was raised by someone else. And through that, taking it back to my grandmother. And some of the ways in which I learned theologically here, and through therapy and psychology and neuroscience stuff that I read, that there is a way in which you can go backwards in the place of trauma or in the place of violence and find another exit from that prison. I'm not sure if this is entirely articulable in a logical way. Perhaps some apophatic theology might have some resources here to speak of the way in which we can kind of go mystically backward into places that originate the undoing. And this is where I think Luther's theology might be helpful, insofar as it speaks of the recreation of the broken and sinful world. It can, as much as grace ultimately comes backward from the fulfillment as the eschaton and travels back in time, well, maybe through us it can travel back in time the way it travels through us toward our neighbors. Again, this would require some mystical, perhaps, framing, but I think there are important resources there. And Luther was arguably indebted to the mystics as well, like Theologica Germanica and others.
These both revolve around the law-gospel distinction for Luther, and you can answer either or both if you feel so inclined. Sure. The first is just echoing what I heard you and both Dr. Thompson earlier talk about in Luther's kind of theology of solidarity. Yeah. How often I'm just resonating with seeing that in Luther's thought, but also how often I feel like when he brings up the law, it's alienating. Trying to single out the individual. I think of how he begins his Invocavit sermons when he says death comes for us all and we all have to face God on our own, or the individual conscience being captive to the word of God, both in a sense of receiving that kind of judgment. And I wonder, first question, if you see any kind of echo there where grace is experienced in community and solidarity, union with Christ and the saints, whereas as judgment standing in before the law as a mirror is very individual, very kind of isolating. That's question number one. Question number two is about just trying to understand more how trauma relates to sin or the experience of God. And I'm thinking both of the judgment of God properly and also the experience of the idolatrous God that Luther focuses on so much. I think it's easy for me to imagine the experience of the idolatrous God in Luther's thought, who comes to us and says, here are all the things you must do to make me happy with you, as being a source of spiritual trauma, something that you talked about. I also think, too, as a parish pastor, how often people experience the judgment of God in Scripture as something that is traumatic to them, and how we can distinguish between, are both traumatic? How do we distinguish between the mirroring of the law for Luther and the trauma inflicted by the idolatrous God? Is there a way to do that? What would that look like?
Yeah, these are great questions. So let me start with the latter one, and I might ask you to repeat the former one by the, and I want to be careful with time too. But okay, so God's judgment, how there is no denial that that people experience a lot of not only spiritual trauma, but spiritual abuse in churches and in church systems and in pastoral theologies that seek to either condemn people who don't conform to a particular framework of life or a particular theology or a particular lifestyle. And that can be horribly detrimental. That could be truly traumatic. Now, how to speak of a certain reality of the judgment of what's sinful, if I hear you correctly, and not be condemnatory to people, right? Well, here is a piece of Barthian theology. So it might be a small import here. Well, another disciple of Luther, right, who thinks that ultimately God is a judge of what threatens us, not of us. God's affirmation of life is undiluted and unequivocal. What God does condemn is what comes from outside God's good creation to menace it in some way. Now, Barth also says that something is nothing, but that's complicated in his theology. But I think with all of my critiques of Barth for other ways in which, some other dimensions of his thought, I think this is a particularly helpful part of what he says, namely a distinction between how ultimately what God judges is what comes against us. And to go back to Dr. Irwin's question, in a way, this is not a Manichaean universe where you have good and evil on par. This is a world in which God is the loving God, the Alpha and the Omega. So God is large enough, God's love is capacious enough to absorb the distortion that makes its way into God's good creation. The distortion is not something that stands a chance with a God of love. Does this answer? And remind me of your first question.
The first question was just kind of hearing more from you and from Dr. Hansen about Luther's theology of solidarity.
Oh, yeah.
All the ways in which, Luther, grace is communally experienced, but judgment is individually experienced. And I wonder if that's something, if that's a fair thing, if you could see pushback to that.
Yeah, I think both grace and judgment is both individual and communal. That's a very short answer, but over coffee more.
Yeah,
Dr. Hansen has already left for the airport, but let's again thank our three remaining speakers, Dr. Kärkinen, Dr. Thompson, and Dr. Marandiuc. We have a lot of food for thought, and the YouTube link I sent you, the second one, can give you access to these lectures. Again, if you want to go back and hear once more some of the things that you need to chew on a bit. Please stop on your way out of the building at the table, and if nothing else, grab one of those refrigerator magnets. It has a little QR code that will link you to the Kindling Faith page and the calendar of events. We have a lot of wonderful things coming up, not the least of which are some of our speakers this spring, including authors Anthony Ray Hinton and Kate Bowler. So we do look forward to hopefully seeing you at future events, many of which are hybrid. And thank you for your ministries. May God bless you and Godspeed. And do take care. President Irwin, do you have any final words? Okay, just sayonara and safe journeys, friends.